No more jokes.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode, this time without any jokes because it saves me time. Okay, let's go on. Alright, so today we're going to be talking about a little bit more about discernment because I just forgot to cover a specific point, and then we're going to talk about the different state of life vocations. That's what I call them. People last year, I brought this up, might have been a little confused, but this is what I mean. State of life vocations. These four things are what your state of life is. Okay, and I'm going to talk about how they work and some misconceptions regarding them. All right. So first, that discernment point. Okay, you need to pay attention to when you feel a certain way. All right. So when you're praying, when you're discerning, when you're thinking about all the things that are going on, you need to really pay attention to when you felt a specific way. When did you have that anxiety? When did you have that fear? When did you feel fulfilled? When did you have that joy? When did you have excitement, etc., etc.? So up top here, I threw two examples. You're excited when you're around, you could say a person. You're excited when you're around, this person. But then when you're praying, you feel stressed out while praying. You feel anxious. You feel uneasy. You feel that something's wrong. These are two opposite emotions. These are two opposite experiences, and you're having them at different times. Now, if you remember from the assignment that you did yesterday, when St. Ignatius was in prayer, he was uneasy about the topic that he was thinking about. He said, I didn't feel like I had an answer. But after a while, as he kept praying and praying, he would notice that while he was in prayer, he had the certainty, and while he was out of prayer, he was just, unsure. And so prayer is kind of the staple. You got to pay attention. How are you feeling in prayer? Because prayer is going to be when you are the most focused. Okay? I think I'm actually going to say that in a second here. It'll pop up. So you're excited when you're around a person or when you're doing a job or something. And then when you're in prayer, you're very anxious about it. You're very uneasy. I threw another example over here. You feel a sense of joy or meaning while helping your friends with their studying and their homework. And when you are helping out in the hospital, you are frustrated and it's unenjoyable. Now let's say you thought your vocation, your plan for your vocation, your hope for your vocation was that you wanted to be a nurse or something. But whenever you're helping out in the hospital, let's say you're in high school or you're in college and you have a temporary internship or a job at a hospital or you're just volunteering, and anytime you're there, you're frustrated and it's unenjoyable. Meanwhile, you get a lot of joy and meaning out of helping your friends with their homework and studying. Well, maybe that's a good indication that you're called to do something that's more one-on-one helping people with something, educational. So maybe you're called to be a teacher. Maybe you're called to be in a kind of job that helps individuals, one-on-one with something. That would be a good sign that you're not called to work in the hospital. If when you are working in the hospital, let's say when you're not working in the hospital, you're fine. And you have all these romantic ideals about what it's like to work in the hospital, and you're like, oh, I feel called. But then when you actually go and do it, you don't. You feel frustrated and unenjoyable. It feels unenjoyable. Well, when you're praying, you should notice that. Well, when I'm at the hospital, it's really frustrating, unenjoyable. But when I'm not there, it just seems like, yes, that's exactly where I want to be. Well, probably you created a fake person in your head, right? Just like people do when they put people on a pedestal. So you put your job on your pedestal, okay? And paying attention to when you feel a certain way is going to be how you discern that. So pay attention how you feel in prayer and pay attention when you feel a certain way because it'll tell you everything. So I said pay attention. I said you're uneasy while you're in prayer down here, but excited when you're next to this person or next to this job or doing this job. Prayer is the truly focused you. But I said if there's an anxiety or fear, you always have to ask what? What do you always have to ask if there's an anxiety or fear that comes up? You always have to ask why. Why am I afraid? What am I afraid of? Okay. Actually, I don't know why I put why. The question is, what are you afraid of? So moving on to state of life vocation. There's four of them. They're your state of life because they indicate what state of life you're in. Okay, so first one is marriage. Second one is celibacy or the single life. Third one is religious life. Fourth one is priesthood. I really should have called celibacy single life there. Ignore that. Make that single life. I'm not going to edit this. I'll go back and edit afterwards, but it doesn't matter because it's going to be a video. It should be single life. Marriage, single life, religious life, priesthood. So let's just get into it. Marriage. All people are called to marriage by the nature of their bodies being made for marriage. That's theology of the body. Now look, I bolded that term. That's because that's going to come up a lot this last semester here. Theology of the body is this thing made by, it's a bunch of homilies by Pope St. John Paul II. And it's this whole theology around sexuality, little s sexuality, okay? And everybody is a little s sexual being because we're all made as male and female. And so we're all called to marriage by the nature of our bodies. You know, if you are physically capable of having sex, you are called to marriage by the nature of your. Actually, I won't even say that, because if you are made male or female, you're called to marriage, because that in itself is a sexual thing. Whether or not you could be born with some deformity that's like there's no way you're able to have children, but it doesn't matter. If you're made male or female, aka if you're made a human, you're called to marriage, because everything about your body still says male and male and female is a sexual, little s sexual thing, right? Because like if there's no procreation, there's no need for men and women to be different. We would just be all one gender if we could all just, spontaneously, not spontaneously, what's it? Asexually reproduce, right? But no. So we're all called to marriage. Now, it begs the question, well, then we're done here, right? What's the need to discern if everyone is called to marriage by the nature of our bodies? Because, then we're called to marriage. No discernment. Well, here's the problem. Is that some people are also called to celibacy. All right? So there's this, if you are human, if you have a body, by the theology of the body, you're called to marriage. Okay. Well, some people are also called to celibacy, and that might be the bigger calling, and that's where they need to go instead. So the call to marriage by the nature of our bodies is true. It's a call. But it could be that God is giving a different, clearer calling that contradicts it. And I'm going to say this later on, but because, well, you know what? No, I'll just talk about it later. Okay? God doesn't contradict himself, though, Mr. Anderson. So from now on, we're going to be operating under the multiple callings theory, because I personally think that's how it works. Some people can disagree, but it doesn't matter, because it's more helpful when dealing with feeling like there's competing callings inside of you. And that's my primary tool this semester, is teach you how to discern these different callings, for people who are called to marriage to end up in a successful marriage, for people who are called to priesthood or religious life to actually end up there instead of ending up somewhere else. That's my mission this semester. And so this is going to be the more helpful way, is to operate under the multiple callings theory, which is this, right? This idea over here, that there are multiple doors you could go through that are God's plan. Okay. So let's go through another one. So 2 out of 4 so far. Single life. Now, this is synonymous with celibacy, but the problem is that you can be celibate in 2 of the other states as well. So, calling it the single life. Very few people are actually called directly to the single life. It's one of the 4 state of life vocations. The single life is, as it's just not celibacy itself, right? So, if you're called to the single life specifically, not just celibacy, okay, not the and not religious life or priesthood, then you're called to live a normal life, a lay secular life, but while single instead of married. So if you're called to the single life, you're not going off and becoming a religious and joining the Franciscans or Dominicans or Jesuits. You're not going off and becoming a priest, okay? You're not going off and living as a monk, or a nun or whatever, whatever. You're called to live a normal life in everyday society, but you're single, okay? It's just a state of life. It's not any more special than marriage or priesthood or religious life. And those things aren't any more special than marriage. These are all just state of life. One's not above the other. Like any vocation, it should not be embraced negatively or by default. A distaste for marriage is not a call to the single life. So a lot of people, first of all, will just go through these phases where they're like, I can't find anybody. Maybe I'm just called to be single. It's like, okay, that's bullcrap. That's drama, right? I had a friend who Everyone's had this, right? You got this friend, breaks up with a significant other. They're all crying. They're like, "Oh, I'm never gonna get married. I'm never gonna be in another relationship because it's just too hard, and women or men are like this, and yada yada." I had a friend like that. He said, "Oh, it's gonna be so hard to find somebody. I'm not gonna date ever again. It's gonna be forever." 3 months later, he's dating somebody, and now they're married. It's like, come on. Okay, same thing. Like, just because you can't find anybody doesn't mean you're called to the single life. And just because you have a distaste for marriage, you might be like, "Oh, I don't want to be married. I hate the idea of marriage." Okay, maybe that's just something you need to get over. maybe you're called to marriage, and you just have a block. You have a roadblock. You have a mind block, a mental block. Okay, no. A distaste for marriage is not a call to the single life. A call to the single life is a call to the single life. Okay, that means you have to discern it. You can't just default into the single life. But fun fact, you're all in this state right now. So people are like, "Oh, I wouldn't want to do that. That's terrible." What do you mean? What do you mean that's terrible? That's how you're living your life right now. So a lot of people play up the single life like it's the worst thing in the world. Well, yeah, maybe you're called to marriage, and that's why you feel like it's the worst thing in the world, because most people are called to marriage. But don't act like it's the worst thing in the world, because you're literally in it right now. So all those people right now who are like, my life right now is the worst thing in the world. Calm down. Okay, religious life, celibacy. So religious life is celibate. So I said single life is celibate. It has to be, right? Religious life is celibate. So religious life means a communal life shared with a group of individuals who have the same mission as you: feeding the poor, educating, preaching, etc. Okay? So you got pictures of Franciscans in the top right there. There's a female Franciscan order, but I don't have them pictured. And I think those are Dominican. Yeah. No. No. Those aren't Dominicans. Wait, yeah, they are. They got the big rosaries. I don't know. I think those are Dominicans. Anyways, religious life is practiced celibately. It's pretty hard to raise a family in community, and it's pretty bad for the children. Just psychologically, we can raise them like that. Things like that have been tried before. Communally, like families coming together and trying to live a religious life. It never worked out. Never worked out. Religious life is its own calling. It's not like priesthood light. It's not like, oh, since I can't become a priest, I'll be a nun since I'm a woman, or oh, since I don't really want to be a priest, I'll be a religious brother. No. Again, you don't default to this. This isn't like the next step. It's its own calling. These are all their own callings. Okay? And I said, in fact, St. Francis, the famous guy who started the Franciscans, he wasn't even a priest. Most people are like, well, most people don't even think about that. But then the people who do are like, oh, he's probably a priest. No. He wasn't even a priest. Never became one. He was very against it. He was like, no, I'm not a priest. So because it's practiced celibately, but it's not inherently celibate, you could have competing calls to religious life and marriage. Okay? The only thing that is inherently celibate is this. Okay? This is the only thing that's inherently celibate. This is not. Which is frustrating if you feel like you have a call to marriage and religious life. Priesthood, holy orders. I said holy orders because there's also deacon and bishop here. But, yeah. But notice, deacons can get married if they're married before they be deacons, which shows, again, celibacy is not inherent to priesthood or holy orders. In fact, in the book of Timothy, Paul writes, let bishops only be married once. Number one, priesthood is the call to shepherd a parish. That's what it is. Okay? It's not to live a more holy life. Everybody's called that. In the New Testament, priests were called presbyters. Presbyters assisted the bishops, who were the elders. Okay? Priesthood is currently celibate for the Roman rite of Catholicism, but like religious life, it's not inherently opposed to marriage, meaning you could have conflicting calls inside you. I mean, I'm biased. My dad is a priest and married, which shows that he's called to both. Okay? So what do you do if you're called to both? Well, I said, priesthood is not just the call to live your faith more deeply. Everyone's called to live their faith more deeply. It's also not just the call to leave everything and follow Jesus, because religious life is also the call to leave everything and follow Jesus. Priesthood is specifically just number one, okay? It's the call to shepherd a parish. That's what it is. So, these are opposites, marriage and single life. Marriage and celibacy are opposites. That's why priesthood often gets told as an opposite to marriage, because you can't be married as a priest. but that's a rule that the church made for organizational purposes. Okay? Um, so these are not opposites. Okay, these are opposites, these are not. You could, theoretically, now look, I'm not arguing that religious people should be married, but theoretically, it could happen, okay? Like, religious life is just individuals making vows and deciding that they want to work together as a community. You could do that while married. It just happens that it really doesn't work out that well. So you could be married and be religious. You can be married and be a priest. Okay? You could be single and be religious. You can be single and be a priest. It just happens that most of those on the right are single. Okay, so they're not opposites. So what happens if you feel like you're called to marriage and religious life, or marriage and priesthood? Well, you need to discern. Is God giving you a choice? He gives some people a choice. Is he directing primarily towards one? I think that'll tend to be the case. Father Jim really felt like he was in that relationship, but he felt like God was directing him primarily towards priesthood. So he's like, I got to choose it. I mean, I kind of felt like, no, I didn't feel like I had a choice. I mean, I felt free to choose, but I really felt like God was primarily directing me towards marriage. And it was frustrating for me to get over, because I had romanticized this idea of religious life. I really wanted to do it. And then God was like telling me, once I just got over my thick-headedness and discerned properly, he was like, nah, you're called to marriage. And then I was like, ah. I mean, I say it was but it was also like joy, which is the whole point of like it actually being what God wants for you. So which one's fulfilling? Yada yada. You go through the steps of discernment. So on the right over here, wanting to get married doesn't mean you're called to it. Okay, that's the important point I said I'd come back to in the beginning. Almost everybody wants to get married. Just remember here, everyone is called to marriage by the nature of their bodies, which means almost everyone wants to get married. Okay, and by that I mean almost everyone wants to be with another person. Okay, some people are like, oh, I'm abusive, I don't want to get married. Like, whatever, that's marriage. Like, you're married. You haven't committed because, you're what's an adjective I can properly use here? I don't know. You're a coward. You don't want to go all in. You're a weak person, or you just have a really bad, stereotype of it, and you can't get over your fears, or you can't get over some kind of wound or something. In which case, you need to be braver and realize that. So just because you want to doesn't mean you're called to it. So here's what I said down here. Fact: most priests and religious want to be married. Okay. Now, if you ask them if they want to be married, they'll give you this really roundabout answer of like, "No, I'm happy as a priest." And it's like, no, yeah, of course, that's your calling, but that's not what I asked. Do you also want to be married? And most people, when they discern, don't even think about this. I was at the seminary because that's where I got my degree in theology, and I was talking to these seminarians, and like, they wouldn't look at it this way because they refuse to, and not all of them, just some of them, mostly the younger ones, but I mean a lot of them, they refuse to accept that there are multiple desires within themselves, multiple callings within themselves, because they just don't like that idea, because that opens the door to marriage, and if they want to be a priest, they want to close the door to marriage. We'll talk about that in a sec. So I said most priests and religious want to be married. They have that desire. Like, they would love to be with somebody and live a life. It's just, and Father Jim will agree with me on this, it's just that they also feel more called to be a priest, or they feel more called to be in religious life. So Father Jim could be like, he said in Q&As, he's like, yeah, I could be a happily married man right now. But he said, but I feel more fulfilled being a priest, and God makes up for it. And so, yeah. So let's say I made up some numbers right now. Let's say I said 95% of people are called to marriage. Okay, so it's, if in a room of 30 kids, that's all but one kid. All right, 2 to 3% are called to be religious. So it's like a third of a student in a room of 30. All right, 2 to 3% are called to be religious. 1% are called to the priesthood, and 1 to 2% are called to be single. Now, if you notice, this adds up to like 101%. That's because this varies. I don't know. These are all made up. But here's a point that I really want to make here. Again, these are totally made up, but I think it's a pretty good guess from my end. 100% of people, 100% of people who are called to marriage are called to marriage. Right? I don't know why I'm laughing. Um, religious life. 80% of people who are in religious life, I think, are called to celibacy. I think 20% of people who join religious life are called to marriage. Now look, uh, remember how I said marriage and celibacy are opposite callings? This is what I'm talking about. You can be called to marriage and religious life. And if you choose religious life, well, you're celibate now. Were you called to celibacy? I mean, kinda. If God's calling you to be a religious, like a sister or a brother in an order, clearly He's going to give you the tools to be celibate. But you were also called to marriage, so you got to deal with that, right? Priesthood. I think 75% of people who are called to priesthood are also called to marriage. I think 25% of the men called to priesthood are also called to celibacy. Okay? Same thing with religious life. You know, you're going to be celibate as a priest in the Catholic faith. Okay? Maybe not Orthodox. Maybe not some of the Eastern ones if you get married before you become a priest, but you got to deal with the fact that you're also called to marriage. Okay? You can't just say, like, that calling's not there in me. Like, it's not there. You have to maturely deal with that. And look, a lot of men who go to the priesthood, or a lot of people who go to religious life, women or men, are going to not deal with that call to marriage. They're going to toy around with it a ton because they never really said no to it, or they never really accepted that it's there. Like, you have to freely choose the priesthood or religious life. Okay? If you feel like forced into it by God and you didn't say no to your call of marriage, if you feel like you personally did not turn down marriage, well, then it's constantly going to be there as a choice for you. And then you're going to be one of those priests who leaves the priesthood and becomes married. Or you're going to be one of those religious who leaves religious life and becomes married, okay? Was that because you were called to marriage all along? Well, yeah, of course you were called to marriage. First of all, by the nature of your body. Second of all, probably just because you were called to marriage also. But let's say you were still called to religious life more. Well, then you messed up. Like, yeah, this is the good alternate that God has for you, but like there was a good primary that was probably better, and you didn't deal with marriage properly. You didn't say no to it, which gets me to this idea. Oh, single life. 100% of people are called to single life, or 100% of single life people are called to celibacy. Otherwise, you wouldn't be single, right? Okay. But that idea I wanted to come to. You have to say no before saying yes. That's something my spiritual director told me. Super helpful. Before following your vocation, you have to say no to other vocations. So, like with the job, like you can't become an engineer until you say no to everything else. And by becoming an engineer, you say no to everything else. But if you're always toying with the idea of becoming something else in your mind, you haven't truly said no. You could walk out of that job at any point, okay? And I think the younger generation, by the fact that, and this is including me, we job change all the time. We don't stay in a stable job the way our parents did. I think money's part of that. But if you stay in the same job, you can move up the ladder if you're competent. So if anything, it's even better for you monetary wise most of the time. But we don't say no to other vocations. Okay, and so especially the ones that you're called to, you have to say no to the vocations you're called to. So you're called to marriage and religious life. You got to say no to one of those. Otherwise, the other one's going to be tempting. Otherwise, you won't fully be living out your vocation. You'll be like half in. You can't have your heart be half in. Like your heart needs to be totally married or totally religious life or totally single life or totally priesthood, whatever. So example, let's say you feel the call to marriage and religious life. All religious orders are celibate. That's a problem. This means you got to say no to marriage before saying yes to religious life. If you don't, you're going to struggle through the celibacy part of religious life. And I don't mean struggle like wishing you were married sometimes. I mean struggle like feeling, what if I left and became married? Okay? If you don't, you're going to, so vice versa. If you don't say no to religious life and you get married, you might always look back at it with longing and be like, oh, I could have had this like holy life with God and like been a religious life and, did these things and went out and worked with the poor. No, look, you can be married and like work with the poor and do all this good service, but you can't turn your home into like a little monastery, right? And like be praying 4 hours in the morning, 2 hours before bed, and structure your whole life like maybe religious life might be, okay? And like have your children get up and like eat meal and then do communal prayer and then do whatever. Like, yeah, like be holy living with your family, but you can't turn your marriage into religious life. You got to be realistic about how much you're going to do. So you can be dissatisfied in marriage and like, I only get to pray half an hour a day. I want to pray like an hour and spend all this time today. So it's like, okay, like that's not what marriage looks like once you have kids, because you got a lot of free time when you don't. So my last idea here is the different levels of vocations. Okay, so you were called to a category first. So you're called to one or two of the four state of life vocations first. Then you're called to people or orders within it. You can't be called to a person or an order without being called to that lifestyle. Now I say duh. Well, let's take an example of what I mean. Okay, so let's say on the left here you got the four state of life: marriage, religious, priest, single life. On the right here, you got categories. You got marriage. Okay, you could marry Sarah. You can marry Josh, whatever, etc. Right? There's no Josh in this grade, right? That face when I forget that there's a Josh in this grade, and then like sadness. Anyways, religious life. You could be a Franciscan, Dominican, Jesuit. Priesthood. You'll be a priest in the Diocese of Lansing. I don't know. I'm making these up at this point, but for these first two categories at least, right? Let's say, here we go. Let's say you feel like you're not called to marriage and you're not called to priesthood, but you kind of feel called to religious life. You kind of feel called to single life, okay? So what do you got to decide between? Well, now you got to decide between those two, religious life or single life. And then you decide, if I'm called to religious life, am I called to Franciscans, Dominicans, Jesuits? What order am I going to go to? Okay? But now let's say this happens. Let's say, you meet a friend Sarah, you meet your friend Josh. You're totally into them. You're like, whoa, okay, like I could totally see myself being married to this person. All right. You are not called to be with Sarah if you are not called to marriage. It's that easy. It doesn't matter if you like Sarah. If you like Sarah or you like Josh and you want to be with them, but you don't feel called to marriage, just remind yourself, everybody's called to marriage by the nature of their bodies. Of course you like this person, okay? You're not asexual, all right? There's going to be people you like. But marriage, if you decided you're not called to marriage, then that needs to be closed off. These need to become X's, okay? You decided no here. Now it could be, like in my case, I decided no on marriage, but you met somebody and it turned out that discerning if you should be called to them helped you realize, I'm called to marriage. I just didn't meet the right kind of person yet, right? So you could be like, oh no, I'm totally called to single life because you just never met the right person. That's why you have to be careful. You can't just compare. You can't discern marriage by discerning these individual people. Like you can't look like, let's say Sarah sucked or Josh sucked, and you're like, oh, I hate these people. I don't want to be married to somebody like that. Therefore, I must not be called to marriage because these are the only people I've ever met. Okay, no, it sounds like you need to get out more and actually meet more people than the 5 people right? Oh, that went deep. I'm sorry. That's just my life. You need to meet more than the 5 people and turns out once you meet somebody that's not, sucky, oh, actually, I could totally be married to them. And actually, you know what? I feel all this joy about marriage now, and I was totally anxious about single life all along. Okay, so that's what's important. You need to be careful about just Xing this off or checking this off right away. You got to look at everybody. You got to ask yourself, does everybody just suck, or am I not called to marriage? Okay? Or, if I'm not called to marriage, but you meet somebody that's nice, well, like figure out, does that mean that everyone just sucked before, or does that mean that this is just, a nicety, but turns out you're not called to marriage anyway? Okay? Let's say you're not called to religious life, but you're like, oh, I could totally be a Franciscan. Right? So, let's say that's an X. No, you're not called to be a Franciscan because you're not called to religious life. Like, no, you're not called to Sarah because you're not called to marriage. Okay? You can't be a priest in the Diocese of Lansing if you're not called to priesthood. Alright. That's actually all I got for you guys today. So, watch this. There'll be a quiz on it on Friday. And that's all I got. So, see you next time.